on this discussion. Lastly, I just want to call out that we will be sharing the output of today's discussion with you all within a couple of days, so you can refer to it in your own time and discuss with your colleagues, etc. So please don't hold back in sharing your views, experiences, and please ask any questions you have so we can make it as good a discussion as we possibly can. Now, sorry, before we begin, I'd just like to introduce you to the team for today's discussion. We've got Ivy from a marketing team who's helped us put the event together, and she's going to be assisting in managing the meeting as well as managing the mirror board that I'll be shortly sharing. We've got Gavin from the Quorum team. Gavin's got over 20 years of experience in IT and specializes in the fields of enterprise cybersecurity, solution architecture, cloud computing, and identity and access management. Gavin has been involved in a number of senior roles and provides proactive advice and solutions for organizations on how to operate securely and effectively in hybrid environments with using many devices and services. And joining us also from the Quorum team is Daniel. So Daniel's over 16 years experience in the IT industry, covering all aspects of the service design, implementation, and management of security and operational service offerings, including understanding customer business requirements and development of solutions and models. Lastly, as I mentioned at the top of the call, I'm the head of product at Antares and look after a couple of products, including TELUS, which is a Teams governance and management product that helps customers implement best practice teams, and we'll be discussing some of those practices from a security, at least from a security and governance perspective today. So without further ado, let's get started. We'll just shortly share my mirror board on the screen, and we'll be able to kick off the discussion. Just give me a minute while that happens. Cool. So you should now be able to see the mirror board on your screen. Sorry, sorting out a couple of things. All right. So maybe I can go just kick off the discussion with Teams. And what I'd like to begin today is around the common pitfalls we find quite commonly with Teams implementations working with customers on a daily basis. And I'm sure Gavin and Daniel will have a lot more to say than I do. But I wanted to start off by saying that Teams is a great platform. It's really streamlined the communication and collaboration now with customers. We have customers now have its staff internally within the organization, but as well as with partners. What we do commonly find is that most customers don't have a well-planned governance and security measure in place when it comes to Microsoft Teams, and that's definitely a common pitfall that we're finding. Now that's not necessarily customers' fault as such. If you think about the events in the last couple of years, COVID has played a huge part in the activation of Teams, and customers haven't had chance to think about the Teams implementations and haven't had chance to properly plan the implementation of it. And what has happened is that it's led to a couple of things. Most customers nowadays are struggling with what we commonly known as team sprawl, where you got lots and lots of teams created in the environment, and that is leading to a range of issues in managing the Teams environment itself, difficulty in finding information from an end user perspective, this confusion around which teams to keep or not keep, and leading to, in many cases, ineffective use of the platform. And secondly, what we're finding is that most customers don't know exactly what best practice Teams implementation is, and it's primarily because you can just turn on Teams and you're off and running pretty quickly. So seemingly everything will work and everything will look under control, but most implementations nowadays, when you have a look at them under the hood, 6 months, 12 months down the road, they're having a range of issues, and we hope to cover some of them today. Gavin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you're commonly finding when it comes to Teams implementations. What are some of the common pitfalls that you come across?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. Really pleased to be here. Looking forward to some robust discussion. I'm sure some challenging questions. Feel free to, challenge us. We'll do our best. Yeah, I almost wasn't sure to sort of laugh internally or sort of cry internally. We're hearing about sort of team sprawl or organic growth. I think that's so true, right? And I reflect, yeah, as you highlighted in the bio, been in the industry a long time, right? So long gone are the days when security teams can say no to the business. Security teams have to be an enabler. They have to be an intrinsic part of the business, right? As you rightly point out, being thrust into this kind of new normal that I still feel like we're actually just working our way through the new normal, kind of hopefully getting through sort of COVID. Now, certainly the challenges aren't over, right? I feel for security teams. I speak to security teams really on a daily basis, but also stakeholders within the business that aren't always within the security team, right? And those are some of the pieces I'm keen to unpack today if we can, really from a data perspective, right? Now, I think that's really where I think Teams is focused on. Security, sure. Do we take some of that for granted in terms of end-to-end encryption? Absolutely. Do we just expect some of that to be commodity? Certainly I do. Right, in terms of encrypted communications. It does get a little bit more tricky, absolutely, when we think in terms of compliance and the governance side. And for what that means to me personally is really data assets, right? The complexities that we sometimes don't perceive because, as you pointed out, it's easy. Get up and running with Teams. We start using it. We figure our way through it. We start collaborating. We start sharing. What does that mean for security teams, right? Trying to keep everything within a boundary, certainly from a data perspective. And that's not always the point I'm trying to get to, is not always the responsibility of the security team. Yes, the security team there is to make sure that you don't have identity compromise, so that someone else is, jumping into your Teams meeting when they shouldn't be. Who are we sharing data with? But from a data perspective, that what I've seen in my experiences is sits more with the risk and compliance team, if there is such a team within an organization. Sometimes, members in teams are wearing multiple hats. That's also a very common scenario, right? Final thoughts, it's always around sort of balancing security and usability. It doesn't matter what platform you're using, you need to manage the risk down to an appropriate level, and that's largely dictated by the business. But you also have to inform the business, right? They're not always coming from an expert position. They understand what makes their business operate, and what their strengths are from a business perspective, but they often don't understand the potential weaknesses and risks when using a platform such as Teams, right? So the consumption side is easy. Sometimes the security side is a little bit harder. I try not to throw around too many acronyms, as a techie myself, as a security evangelist, sometimes you just can't help it and you also get sucked in. So we will throw terms up like zero trust, right? Yeah, if you haven't heard that before, I'm not sure where you've been, but we certainly want to talk about it today. But what does that mean in terms of practical terms, right? Everyone's heard the term zero trust. How do I apply that in Teams? How do I apply that generally? And how do I make that practical? I think that's more the security evangelist side of me coming out in terms of, I love the terms, but that doesn't help me. How do I move my current position where I am? Again, thinking around that balance in terms of usability, good experience, enabler for the business, but making sure we're not open to excessive risk. So those are some of the bits and pieces that I'd love to unpack with you today.
Awesome. Thanks, Gavin. Great points there. And yeah, definitely lots to unpack. Daniel, wouldn't mind hearing from you. I know you work with customers day in, day out on the ground, and you have first-hand exposure to some of the issues that customers face when it comes to implementing Teams and generally security. What are you finding as common pitfalls with some of the Teams implementations?
Sure. And I'll keep it nice and short. What I've found is customers are asking for turnkey or Microsoft security solutions or platforms or services that secure Teams in any way, shape, or form. They find that their knowledge of security in Teams is non-existent, or they just don't know about the features that Microsoft have available to secure Teams in such a way. They originally believed that security is baked into Microsoft platforms, but just didn't see any evidence of it or want to increase it themselves or see proof, or maybe they're seeing some suspicious behavior on Teams and they want to know what Microsoft is doing about it, or what tools from Microsoft or third party are available to monitor, detect, and either remediate automatically or at least alert based on suspicious activity, basically taking control. So yeah, my recommendations are: did you know about Defender for Office 365? Did you know about the Azure AD Identity Protection platform that is directly related to Teams and authentication, suspicious login details, conditional access policies? All of these features are collectively securing Teams, or can be configured to secure Teams. So yeah, it's basically just general awareness about the products available to customers that can be set up correctly if you know how, where, and why, to increase the security posture of Teams.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. Would love to explore some of these terms that you mentioned, and I'd like, from my perspective, it would be great to understand in more depth some of these things. So thank you for your remarks there. So maybe Gavin, I'll come back to you again. Would you mind sharing some of the trends you're seeing with customers nowadays when it comes to security implementations and Teams?
Yeah, so we're still seeing a lot of interest and demand for zero trust, right? As I said previously, how do we make that practical? Do we focus specifically on Teams when we do a security assessment? To be honest, no. For us, it's part of the M365, Office 365 suite of products, right? There are underlying complexities there because Teams does a very good job, I think, of extracting some of the complexity. So we know it's underpinned by SharePoint. We know it's underpinned by OneDrive. That's not even considering additional third-party apps that you may integrate, right? And it's all quite fluid and quite easy. Federation, sharing. We've certainly all had the conversation around external sharing and the right policies to be put in place, when we started using OneDrive and components like that. So when we do security assessments, we really take a holistic perspective on M365, but also making sure we're going to the appropriate level of detail. In this case, it would be focused on Teams. What are the considerations? As Daniel says, it's also important to drive awareness around some education in terms of products and using the Microsoft capability. Generally, these days, everything is called Defender for something. So you generally can't go wrong, get the product name wrong if you call it Defender. Defender for Teams, not such a thing exists per se, but we have Defender for Office 365. And that's where we really look in terms of threat prevention. We're sharing information. So that could be files, that could be content. So sometimes that introduces malicious content as well. What controls do we have in place to make sure that that's being filtered? I'm not inadvertently uploading a piece of malware onto Teams, which is actually going into SharePoint or OneDrive and the backend, and causing problems within the business. I think it's also important to understand, and this is not specific to Teams, but rather to understand the shared responsibility model when it comes to consuming cloud services. It's sometimes a misconception, unfortunately, still, that customers, and Dan kind of touched on this, is that customers think that Microsoft is doing all of the security lifting. Yes, they're doing a lot. Are they doing all of it? No. You still, unfortunately, have a part to play in this shared responsibility security model. If you weren't aware of that, I was just having a conversation with a customer this week who have started using Office 365, OneDrive, moving into Teams, and I'm thinking in the back of my mind, where's your governance? Team sprawl is going to happen. I'm going to come back to you in a year's time. You may be secured, but it's going to be an absolute mess. I can tell you the top 3 tips and tricks. Make sure you've got a control around your federation. Use sensitivity labels, which I'm sure we'll unpack a bit more to better protect your data, things like that. But also making sure you're consistent in your approach. That's a term that I love using a lot through conversation, advice, in terms of being consistent so you know where you are. Trying to apply controls as consistently as you can. So view your Office 365 environment holistically. Consider the controls that are available. And this is all of the kind of elements we work through when we're doing security assessments. Yes, Zero Trust comes into it, and there's a number of pillars within a Zero Trust framework, from identity all the way to data, the devices, etc. So take that into consideration in terms of what are the use cases for Teams? Who's going to be accessing Teams? What are you going to permit from a data perspective? Again, striking that balance is not always as evident and as easy as it may sound. So work with a group of champions within an organization. Unfortunately, IT and security teams, it would be easy if they had all the answers. They don't. So it's important to work with a group of champions. That's really, really important. So understanding what's available, sharing that with the business so you can manage the risk down, using things like safe links and safe attachments that, yes, are focused on Exchange Online and email, but a lot of those components still apply within a Teams context. So make sure you've got the appropriate level of controls, and be aware what comes out of the box and what doesn't, and potentially where sometimes you actually need to uplift.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Gavin. I picked on a couple of things that you mentioned there, and I want to come back to what you mentioned right at the end. But I think you also mentioned having a holistic view of when you look at the security aspect of it. It's like, you mentioned how Teams is underpinned by SharePoint and OneDrive and so many different workloads. I think it's for those who may not necessarily be aware, I think it's important to understand that when you create Teams behind the scenes, you're creating an Office 365 group within Microsoft terminology. And Office 365 group fundamentally has a number of interrelated workloads. So, for example, when you save content in Teams from an e-discovery and retention perspective, it's saved in Exchange Online. Your files that you're sharing on Teams or emails that you're sharing, they're going in SharePoint Online. The files that you're sharing in one-on-one chat, they go in OneDrive for Business. So there are lots of things to consider, like the meetings that you record. They go in stream. Voicemails are stored in user mailbox, and so many different examples of it. So that's just one aspect of it, and that's where we have tools like Tell Us, which hopefully make your lives easier when it comes to implementing some of these things. So you don't have to worry about where's my data, or how do I have a holistic approach when it comes to creating teams, because like Gavin mentioned, team sprawl, right? How do we control all of that? That's a very important factor there. But Gavin, I'd like to come back to what you mentioned right at the end when you finished, which is around there's certain things that Microsoft does, and there are many other things that customers need to either do themselves or need to think about and need to consider when it comes to implementing security. Would you mind highlighting some of those gaps that exist at the moment?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as I said before, you've got to look at Defender for each of your components. That's really important, even in the context of Office 365. So Defender for Office 365 really is not a component that's included in all the Microsoft SKUs, unfortunately. I would love it if it was. So you've got to figure out what's the right SKU for you. It's Microsoft licensing. You could probably do a 4-hour webinar on that, and we still wouldn't have enough time to unpack that. And we're certainly not Microsoft licensing experts. So you need to work through, it's fairly well documented in terms of, how can I get Defender for Office 365, even if it's in the context and the light of, protecting teams. We've had this dramatic shift. We probably weren't the appropriate security posture that we needed to be. Hopefully now things have settled down a bit. We're doing a bit of an evaluation again of our whole environment. What are our options in this space? It doesn't take a lot of time to actually enable those services. So they're not extremely complex. Even if you're not a specialist in that software component, it is fairly well documented from a Microsoft perspective, and you can get up and running quite quickly. Obviously, you can dial up the complexity in terms of your configuration. If you want to exclude specific items, or you want to craft your policies in a specific way, and that's probably where you're getting into the area where you may get some outside consultation, for experts actually dealing with this day in and day out. It's in terms of, I'm looking at these 5 configuration settings, face value. I think I understand what they're saying, but I'm really kind of nervous to actually turn them on. What happens if this disables the business? They're relying on this collaboration. I'm wanting to drive change, but I'm really nervous around sort of service disruption. In most cases, that won't happen. But again, work with a pilot set within your organization if you're a little bit nervous in terms of what is the true effect of this control. I circle back to zero trust. Practical example is conditional access policies, and that's really a staple component for Microsoft's enforcement around zero trust. Most organizations are using conditional access policies in some form or another. Those again can be implemented in a basic fashion, but the more advanced use cases can specifically wrap teams in it. It is a cloud app, so we can control access to it using conditional access policies. From very, very strict in terms of, we're only permitting this type of data within teams. We want to make sure that it's coming from well-managed, well-controlled devices within the organization. So shifting a little bit away from BYOD, but again, being cognizant of that balancing act in terms of security and usability. Again, IT and security teams, my opinion, my experience, wouldn't be able to make that decision by themselves. So work with the business, work through some use cases, and this is very common for what we find with our professional services engagements, is actually articulating those use cases. Tell me how you currently use Teams. What kind of data are you sharing? Who do you connect with? Is it one-to-one connections, or you're connecting with multiple organizations? You will find patterns most of the time. If you spend a little bit of time there, you can then take those patterns, develop use cases, and then design and architect controls that are appropriate and accordingly. So that's probably a fairly quick win to manage risk, right? We've got to keep risk in our sights when we're thinking about the platforms that we're using and the controls that we want to actually apply to them. So for me, that's always a fairly quick win, is conditional access. As I say, that ties very, very well into your zero trust. And zero trust is a journey, right? Just for clarity, it's not a one-time event. It's not something that you buy off the shelf. I wish it was. Yes, you buy software components from providers that enable controls, but it's more a mindset. It's more a strategy. So you've actually got to buy into that. Most organizations are actually buying into the idea of zero trust. So, you've got to make a conscious decision first. And will there be an organizational shift? Will there be some disruption? Absolutely. But I think it can be managed. Will you achieve everything in one go? No, we have to be practical. We need to articulate our approach. We get to more complex scenarios. You know what I'm going to say. This comes back to data. Again, it comes back to our key assets, which for most organizations still pivots around data.
Awesome. Thanks, Gavin. Just want to unpack a few things there. Daniel, you mentioned, and Gavin, you mentioned like risk there. And Daniel, you mentioned products like Defender, and keen to understand what is Defender, what does it do, and what other capabilities do we have to protect teams?
Sure. So Defender for Office 365 is traditionally like an email filtering platform. And then it got extended to scan for links within emails, and then just having a quick look. Yeah, so links within email and links within documents. The platform then pivoted and provided scanning capabilities and anti-malware capabilities for macros and malicious URLs that might exist within Office documents, which therefore carried over to the SharePoint component. So the platform then evolved to be able to scan SharePoint libraries, malware that might be uploaded by OneDrive, and links within documents within SharePoint sites that have been posted, analyzing the links to determine if they're going to malicious or can contain malicious content or go to malicious websites. I then pivoted again and enabled support for Microsoft Teams, which is, I guess, relevant for this conversation, in that content that gets posted within Teams, documents that get shared within Teams, or hosted within a Teams document library, therefore SharePoint, can now be protected by Defender Office 365 in that all of the content is scanned to determine if there's malicious content being uploaded in the environment. Why this platform is quite powerful is because not only does it have the capability of blocking the malicious activity or the malicious content, but it also enables the integration into Azure Identity Protection, in that if a user has uploaded a suspicious document, it actually flags that user as suspicious. Therefore, when a user has been flagged as suspicious, Azure Identity Protection actually flags that user as being suspicious and can be used as a metric or a condition within your conditional access policies within Azure AD. I guess what that results in is that the user is no longer trusted because of suspicious activity that's happening somewhere in your network. Therefore, conditional access policies will control what that user has access to, whether they're prompted for MFA, whether they're denied access to certain sensitive applications that are running through the platform, and it goes on from there. And so that's how such a simple product that's just doing a virus scan on the cloud platform can integrate with the other Microsoft products and provide like a zero trust automated suspicious activity and blocking and MFA capability. One other product worth mentioning is also Microsoft Cloud App Security, which is a CASB product. That is also another platform that can sit in front of Teams and can actually be looking at the activity and user behavior. So what is a user or a device doing within Teams, within SharePoint, within Exchange Online, not just uploading suspicious content, which is what Defender for Office 365 is looking for. It's actually baselining what the user activity is doing. Are they setting automated email forwarding rules? Are they downloading a lot of content from Teams library to their device? So that sort of suspicious activity. So Microsoft Cloud App Security is also able to detect that suspicious activity and either block the user or feed information into Azure Identity Protection again, flag that user as suspicious, and then allowing your pre-created conditional access rules to use that as a condition to enact some sort of action, whether that's to block the person or to prompt them from MFA prompt if they haven't already been recently. So those are some of the strategies that you can use to protect Teams, SharePoint, and Exchange as well, using the whole, there's 3 particular products from Microsoft.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel, for that. Tyrone, you've got your hand up. Did you want to come off mute?
Yeah, sorry, and I wasn't sure if this was the format of the meeting. I just pricked my instance around the Azure ID protection, Daniel, and the user access rules. Does that come stuck if we're operating in a hybrid AD environment where we've got some on-prem and some Azure ID like it's a bit of a mixed bag. Does the full functionality from a security perspective start becoming less doable?
Yes and no. I mean, Azure Identity Protection is primarily focusing on Azure AD. So if you have applications such as Office 365 that's authenticating against Azure AD, that's where the conditional access policies will get applied, and that's where the suspicious activity will actually be flagged. But if you do have applications that use the on-premises Active Directory, there are other products such as Defender, again, more Defenders, Defender for Identity, which is actually scanning suspicious behavior or user activity on your on-premise domain controllers and is feeding that into the cloud platform. If you would like to automate some of the features that are in Azure Identity Protection in terms of detecting suspicious activity and then applying conditional access policies, and you would like to do things like reset a user account, reset a password on your on-premise Active Directory, we found the best way to do that is to introduce another Microsoft platform called Azure Sentinel, because that gives you the most amount of control, the most amount of flexibility, customizations, and a whole lot more connectors into third-party platforms to do the actions that you require. So one common use case scenario is that we create an Azure Sentinel feed that's collecting logs from all the Defender products, and then we create a Azure playbook to reset a password on the on-premise domain controllers. So yeah, it's all possible once you start to expand the Microsoft security platform, with the very top and most complex platform being Azure Sentinel, but that does give you the most amount of flexibility. So yeah, it's all possible once you know how.
Yeah, it's a great question, Taryn, because for me, I still believe we're squarely in a hybrid era. It would be lovely to say that, we're 100% cloud and it's easy. It's probably not the reality. So yes, do you need some fundamental shifts? Absolutely. Are we on the right trajectory? Yes. I mean, we've had AED Connect for a good number of years in terms of identity synchronization. So that's one way of essentially getting your identity into the cloud. Right? It's not the only option. We have pass-through for customers that are still sensitive around actually storing the salted password hash in the cloud, where they prefer to still come back on premise. If we consider federation like ADFS, Microsoft actually has some really strong wording and recommendations around moving away from ADFS. And from a threat actor perspective, we see ADFS servers being targeted heavily. So what that means in practicality is you need to be shifting not only your identities to Azure AD as an identity control plane, but also your applications. This is not always possible, and there's some smart ways of kind of using smoke and mirrors, for lack of a better term, to engineer around that. But using the federation capability, whether it's SAML or OpenID, but using Azure AD as your identity bridge is really the key pin to all of this. The key pin, to be quite honest, to your zero trust strategy. And as Dan says, that's where your conditional access policies, your control plane comes from, is the IDP, which is Azure Active Directory. So, work to be done, certainly. Not all applications support that, so sometimes it's a modernization or defining a strategy for sunsetting. Legacy applications. We're actually, in the next 2 years, going to sunset that app because it's actually too expensive to reinvest, re-engineer, redevelop, and we're going to move to a cloud app that supports the identity components natively. So, as long as you're thinking along those lines, you will have some success.
Awesome. Thanks, Gavin. I'd like to, you mentioned zero trust a few times, and I know you mentioned that at the top of the meeting, if you haven't heard of zero trust, where have you been? But for those who are maybe at the beginning of their security team journey, would you mind just explaining what is zero trust?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, The best way to try and explain it, and I recall a couple of years ago when I first heard the term, it didn't really resonate with me. I was like, I don't fundamentally understand what's happening here. So as I say, it's a shift in mindset in terms of we've moved away from pure perimeter protection. What that means in English is we're not all sitting behind a firewall or a proxy at the office. That's so relevant in the new normal. As I said, where most of us have worked from home, some are still working from home. Work from anywhere scenarios are very, very common now. They were probably fairly common pre the pandemic. I'd say now it's had a fundamental shift to so many organizations. What does that mean from a practical control perspective? Certainly panic to a certain degree in terms of it was much easier for me to control everything when everyone was at the office sitting behind a single appliance or two, doing filtering, making sure that nothing could come in, nothing that was, bad could come in. It's quite different now in terms of, I honestly have no idea what your home network looks like. Maybe it's very secure, maybe it's not. So that's one of the fundamental changes in terms of the mind shift, in terms of essentially we don't trust any connection. We don't trust any device. Honestly, we don't even trust your identity. One of the key principles within a zero trust framework is strong authentication. So what that means is you absolutely have to have multi-factor authentication. It's just a non-negotiable. And again, what we see from an attack perspective day in and day out is username and password combinations alone are just not sufficient to actually protect our identities anymore. So numerous incidents where we've had big data breaches, because people's identities have been compromised, and often it's a knock-on effect in terms of, I'm sure more than one of us is guilty of this, is kind of reusing credentials to a certain extent, right? So this all comes back to the problem statement. What are we trying to solve? It's not that I don't trust you as an individual. We're dealing in a digital world here. I just need to confirm from a strong perspective, from a strong position, that this is actually you, not someone who's just saying, well, I'm Sulab because I got Sulab's password. Right, so there's a number of those fundamental components that we work through, location being one. We generally don't just have a blanket trust of location. Yes, again, striking the balance, do we want to be prompting users the whole time? No. And that's the balance of, well, if this is a strongly managed device, so endpoints are part of one of the pillars, part of the consideration. If we're actually monitoring your device, we have some hardening on the device. We know it's patched, things like that. Does the level of trust increase? Certainly. Does it increase to a level where we stop evaluating it? No. And that's where I think the two worlds contrast. It's this continuous evaluation, whether it's your identity or your access. Dan mentioned sort of the CASB, so Defender for Cloud Apps, used to be Microsoft Cloud App Security. We can do real-time session monitoring, so we can actually monitor your session to Teams and SharePoint. If anything changes with your session, something happens, someone jumped onto your home network and now they're trying to actually intercept your traffic. Regardless if it's encrypted or not, let's keep the scenario simple. Something has happened that's caused a problem, or we've seen your risk kind of gauge increase. It's gone from no risk actually to low and then to medium. Something is happening. We can actually terminate that session or change the session. It's again the balancing act. Maybe not stopping the session completely, but limiting it from full access to a more read-only type style. So these are some of the kind of pillars, and there's a number of pillars to work through in terms of an identity, a zero trust strategy, like I say, and most of those can be applied in the Teams context. You're still on mute there, Sula.
I made the rookie mistake. So apologies, everybody. Thanks for pointing that out.
It's to the best of us, mate.
I know. I was just saying that if anybody does have any questions, or as you especially hearing Gavin and Daniel, and lots of terminologies, lots of products, etc., being covered, please feel free to ask your question either in the chat or feel free to come off mute or feel free to raise your hand, and we'll come to you. I want to focus the next 10-12 minutes of our discussion on some common systems and tools that could be used, and we've covered quite a lot of them already, but maybe I'd like to start with just understanding, maybe Daniel, can you help us understand how do you know if your team's environment is secure?
Yeah, sure. So I guess not implementing any of the products that we've sort of mentioned today is a pretty good indicator, but there are third-party solutions out there. There are some configuration items within Teams and then within Office 365, many actually, that actually can be configured without using the Defender tools that we've discussed. And one tool that we've used is Microsoft's Configuration Analyzer. Is a free tool that you can run against the Office 365 tendency to actually spit out recommendations for the configuration that you've actually applied. So that's basically our go-to tool to determine what state the customer is at, what changes that need to be made over time, and then help them develop like a 30-day, 3-month, or 6-12-month roadmap on how to adapt either the items that we've discussed today, or even some quick wins to match Microsoft's recommendations. So that would be my first step in recommendation for everyone on this call.
Awesome, that's great.
Just to add to that, Dan, absolutely. Another component, and again, face value, it's quite simplistic, but is secure score, right? We've kind of seen the iteration, the evolution is probably a better word, of secure score actually starting the Office product group a number of years ago. And actually now we have Defender for everything, we have secure score for everything, right? And even at face value, if you're still figuring out where am I in my maturity curve, put zero trust to one side. If that's too onerous, it's too complex for you, you'll get to it. Start with your secure score. If you have a really, really low secure score, you've got to invest in certain areas. And Microsoft tries from an engineering perspective to simplify those insights. And if you work through your secure score recommendations, if you just want to focus on your team's context, you can absolutely do that. But don't just stop there. Make sure you're considering your whole Office 365 suite of capability and products. It's really important, as we said previously, that they work and integrate together. So what I've seen customers do on occasion is almost gamify their secure score. We have this collaboration between organizations in terms of, what's your secure score? Ours is up by 80%. That's really good. It means you're investing in your security posture. There's no guarantees, unfortunately, when it comes to security, but we really have the mantra in terms of the more you invest in your security posture, ideally, the more time you will have when an attack or something starts occurring, right? And it's probably potentially the next topic we could get into in terms of tools and systems. But to try and keep it simple and short, because we're rapidly running out of time, is spend time in your secure score. If you've done that previously and it's been a long time since you've looked at it, go back and figure out what's your current secure score. Microsoft keeps updating the metrics for secure score. Not everything is measurable, but certainly as a basic starting point, it'll give you some really, really good insights.
Awesome. Gavin, how do you monitor security on Teams on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, so I like to keep things simple, and I'm a visual person. So Dan has spoken to Azure Sentinel, a number of times throughout our conversation. And this is really, really a powerful capability within the Microsoft security landscape. So it is a SIEM, so Security Information and Event Management Platform. It also has the automation side of it, which is obviously SOAR, automatically taking actions, whatever that may look like. But it can also be used for simple insights in terms of, again, using visualization. So in a Microsoft context, in an Azure Sentinel context, they refer to it as workbooks. So these are essentially dashboards. And quite quickly, you can take your underlying Teams data in terms of consumption data and actually see from a graphical representation perspective what's actually going on in my Teams environment. Because it's when you're dealing with essentially big data, I find it quite valuable if you use a graphical representation of that, something in terms of a graph, where you see the interrelations between different entities. If I'm trying to figure out, do I have an external sharing problem? Do I have a federation problem? Where can I optimize? Where do I need to focus? Patterns, often what we see from a security monitoring perspective, can be easily distinguishable from a graphical representation, right? So that is easily built into Azure Sentinel. It's actually one of the components that we deploy quite often and actually use that to drive insights. So that's a fairly simple, easy, tool to give you the right insights. Further to that, you can get into much more advanced, complicated use cases. Again, to use a bit of a technical term, sort of hunting. You really need to know what you're looking for in a data set. So if I'm looking for a specific type of activity within my Teams environment, probably more tailored to some kind of malicious activity. Right at the beginning of the conversation, we mentioned third-party apps. That's really a tricky space, and if we think in terms of OAuth apps, in the concept of a user actually granting a permission to an app, sometimes the bad actors try and trick us. We see this in different ways, but also, probably not enough time today, but shadow IT. If Teams is not well governed enough, I didn't do that little checkbox to actually control what users can actually bring into Teams, by themselves without getting some kind of approval. Again, we may have third-party sprawl in terms of, these apps that are just being brought in. Users are just giving permissions to apps and things are happening. So the monitoring of that is really important.
One app that I'd like to cover, which I look after, is Tell Us. And for introduction to those who may not know about Tell Us, it's effectively, think of it as collaboration with guardrails apps. It's been designed with all of the users in mind, not just your IT admins or security admins, or not just your end users. It's been designed to suit the needs of everybody, but designed with the intention of maximizing the use of Teams and other tools available in the platform, the Office 365 platform, whilst being compliant with information governance and IT policies. And we covered a lot of the issues around security and governance in our discussion before. But the key things we tell us is that you can apply the right levels of security and compliance based on the information that you store in the Teams. And Gavin mentioned sensitivity labels, and Tell Us integrates with that with right in the compliance center in Office 365. And it leverages your existing investments in Office 365 licenses to be able to automatically apply those labels for you, and then automatically apply the rules behind those. So, if you've got a team with highly confidential information, maybe you don't want that to be accessible through unmanaged devices, is one example. Maybe you want to put some watermarks or labels on that information. Maybe you don't want guests to be able to access that, and a range of different rules that you can apply there. We talked about team sprawl. One of the common issues we find with Teams implementations is that you don't know which teams are in use, who created these teams in the first place, and which departments do they belong to. So we allow the ability to catalog the information that is being stored for you to better manage the team, so you can see which teams are owned by who, who's the the owner of this team. So when we say owner, I mean the business owner, not just the owner who's been added as an owner in teams, but who's your single point of contact that is ultimately responsible for whatever happens in that team. And that person may not necessarily be technical person or necessarily involved in the day-to-day working of that team. That may be a head of department, or as an example. Things like workflow approvals that are built into it. So again, in Microsoft Teams, you can go and create teams at your will. Or on the flip side, you can restrict it so that only very handful of people or IT administrators can go and create teams. And just having those approval processes already built in when you're requesting a team, or applying the best practice templates. So one of the other things we find quite commonly is that you've created a team, but then you've got all sorts of, people don't know what you can do with that. Like, Teams is a huge platform, and you can create different channels. You can bring different apps, like Gavin mentioned at the beginning. But how can you create that true template that is maybe, if you do manage a lot of projects, as an example, how can we make sure that your budget tracking tool and your project scheduling tool and your document management platform, they're all in that template in that team, as whilst applying the right level of security and governance around that sort of stuff. So I wouldn't go into a lot of detail here, but I did want to highlight, given that we are discussing security and compliance, that TELUS is something that we are increasingly implementing for a number of institutions, especially to solve their governance and management issues when it comes to Teams. I'm conscious of time. Gavin, if there was one message that you wanted to land today, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, the time just goes so quickly, doesn't it, when you're having fun? I hope you're having some fun. But I think that there's a lot of capability. We wanted to talk about Microsoft Ignite that recently completed. There's a lot of information, a lot of change. And I think the rate of change can be quite challenging, to be honest, in terms of, even if we just look in terms of the Teams context in a security perspective, what is new for Microsoft? Right, the Ignite book of news, if you go and search for that, is really good. It's quite well structured. Go look at the security enhancements for Teams. There's a number of them, right? Supporting geolocation now, again, probably more tailored to organizations that have to have that geo separation of their data assets, right? But also want to just briefly, in 30 seconds, mention the education side of this. I'm sure numerous of us have children, right? Compliance, due diligence. There's Compliance Manager, which is part of the Microsoft suite. It picks up things like sentiment, and we've unfortunately run out of time today to talk about that. But really, really powerful components in terms of what are individuals, regardless of whether they're in education or more corporate environment, are they following the acceptable use policies around sort of communication and standards? Children are very smart, and we've done some internal testing, and using the smart capabilities around machine learning, AI, they actually track sentiment. So it's not just that Sulab is abusing me, or probably the other way around, I'm abusing Sulab in some form in a single conversation. This may be going over a period of time within the Teams platform, right? It's built for collaboration, but sometimes individuals can try and look to take advantage of that. There's specific components being communication compliance that's focused on that area. So again, there's a lot of capability. Spend some time researching, reach out to us if you want some more information. Like I said, unfortunately, we've just run out of time today. So parting thoughts from me. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Gavin. Daniel, very quickly, did you have any parting thoughts, any key messages you wanted to land today?
Yeah, just team security is at this stage primarily focused around authentication. So knocking off some sort of components of the Zero Trust framework, or focusing on authentication, multi-factor authentication, feeding as many feeds as possible into that authentication decision, whether you allow a person to authenticate or not, as opposed to just simply entering a password, is key to at this stage for success in security with Teams. But as Gav mentioned, there have been quite a number of Microsoft Ignite announcements for security and compliance functionality within Teams. One of the cool ones was the end-to-end encryption now with Teams one-on-one calls, as well as continuous evaluation of access to documents and providing recommendations, which is built into the Teams platform now, as well as a new feature which is going to come quite in handy for me, is suspicious phone calls from outside. So Teams now analyzes mobile numbers that may have been compromised calling your Teams account, to spam you. So that's a new feature within Teams calling that's been announced. Don't think it's generally available, but yeah, lots of things are being announced from Microsoft all the time. So just keep up to date with all of it.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. As you can tell, we're quite passionate about this topic, and we want to help organizations get their Teams implementation right. So you are being more productive and you are getting most out of your Teams and Office 365 environment, and as opposed to worrying about security issues or getting overwhelmed or burdened by your Teams environment getting out of control, etc. So in terms of next steps, we'd recommend you to start with a Teams health check for those who are keen and would like to understand what sort of issues they might have under the hood. We'll share the link for you in the chat now, but that link is also available on the board that you have on the screen. So feel free to go and register. It is free for organizations, I think around above 250 seats. So we do encourage you to use that offer as much as you can. Just to finish up, I'd like to firstly thank you, Gavin and Daniel, for taking all of your time today and for sharing all your views and insights on that. Really, really appreciate it. And we'll have some polls coming up on your screen very shortly that we'd just like you to use to provide us some feedback on how you found the discussion today, and if there were any key areas of interest. If you'd like to explore any of the tools that were mentioned, like from Defender, Sentinel, CyberOne, TELUS, etc. So feel free to let us know if there's anything you'd like to explore further. So please take your time to complete the polls. And other than that, I'd like to thank you all for making your time and making yourself available today. Thank you.